Filreis. I'm in Philadelphia, about a mile from the Kelly Writers House at the University of Pennsylvania. Why am I using my first name and my last name? Well, that's because we're joined today by some new pals, some new participants. And by that, I mean people watching the YouTube live stream. They consist of people who have joined the ModPo MOOC, the open online course on modern and contemporary American poetry, and also the MOOC, the open online course, a free course taught by or led by and coordinated by Sarah Meister at the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA. And Sarah is waving. Sarah, do you want to say hi? Unmute yourself and say hi.
Sure, I'd love to. Hi, I'm Sarah Meister. I'm tuning in from my mother's kitchen. Someone is mowing the lawn. I'm very grateful for that, but I'm going to mute myself when I'm not speaking. And it's just a thrill to think about photography and poetry with you all. So we're so glad to join forces.
Thank you, Sarah. And I love the hat collection that your mom has. I think maybe she's a gardener, I'm guessing. So she's probably out there with the straw hat a lot.
She and my daughter, yes, they're
yeah, this summer. There you go. So Sarah has been leading an extraordinary MOOC, which I'm part of. I've joined it. It's called Seeing Through Photographs. And the current, it's a funny word to say, but the current show, one of the current shows at MoMA is Dorothea Lange, Words and Pictures. And the emphasis there, oh yeah, look at that. Got to buy that catalog, Words and Pictures. And Sarah's pointing to the word words. The emphasis there is on the way in which Lange was interested in not just captions, but the intersection between photography and words. And that and other things gave Sarah and her colleagues Kelly Cannon and Sarah Bodinson and Adelia Gregory and River Bullock, and also who's joined us, Tasha Lutek. Hi, Tasha. There's Tasha from MoMA. The idea of collaborating with us on a live webcast to talk about photography and poetry. So let me just say hi to my other pals, and we're going to get started. I'll describe what the format's going to be, and we'll get started. So first we have Lily Applebaum. Hello, Lily. Good morning.
Morning, Al.
How are you?
You know.
Yeah, that's a yeah. Lily is going to be watching the Twitter feed, as are others of us. And if you tweet and use the hashtag ModPoLive or ModPoLive, Lily will see it. And if there's a moment and if it's compelling and interesting, Lily will signal that we've got some tweets that we could respond to. And that's a good way to respond to your questions and comments. Amber Rose Johnson is here. Hello, Amber Rose.
Hello, Al. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. And Amber Rose has volunteered, in addition to offering her usual amazing brilliance in the comments in the discussion we're having, she's willing to comment on the YouTube stream. That is the comment stream in YouTube as best that she can. And Gabe Ojeda-Sague is here from Chicago. Hey, Gabe.
Hi, Al. How you doing?
I'm okay. And Gabe is going to be looking at the special discussion thread inside the ModPo site, and that's really for the ModPo people who have access to the site. And that stream or that comment thread has been starred so that you can see it right at the top of your feed. We also have Max McKenna here from Chicago.
Good morning, Al.
Hey, Max. And Camara Brown has joined us from, at least for the moment, it's not Cambridge, Massachusetts. Is it? Are you in Cambridge now?
I'm actually in Somerville, Massachusetts.
You're in Somerville. And I'm happy to announce to everyone, not just the ModPo people, but the MoMA people, that Camara, after a couple of years away from ModPo, is joining us again this fall as a ModPo TA. So glad that you're here. Kate Colby is here. Hi, Kate.
Sorry, good morning.
Good morning, Kate from Providence, Rhode Island, who is a poet who thinks a lot about visual art and is a real ModPo person, not a TA technically, but we love having Kate join us. And Amaris Cuchanski, who is in Palo Alto, California, I believe.
Hi, Al. Hi, everyone.
Hi. And Tasha Lutek, I just want to turn back to you. Do you want to say hi and what your role is at MoMA?
Hi, sure. Hello, everyone. I work very closely with Sarah Meister. I'm the photography collection specialist at MoMA, which means I'm responsible for all aspects, various things with the collection. And sometimes I summarize this as making sure we have intellectual and physical access to the collection. So anything that falls under that is my role there.
Fantastic. Welcome, everybody, and welcome to those of you who are watching on YouTube. If you wind up having to go away and then come back or miss some of it, just know that we will put up a recording of the entire thing very quickly. And then Sarah Meister, you'll be happy to know we will do clips and put them out on YouTube that you guys can share as well. So we have four pieces of art to talk about. Before we get to those, I'm going to say what the phone number is. And Chris Martin, hey, Chris.
Hi, Al.
Chris is set up. If he gets frustrated, he's going to pick up that guitar and play us a tune or two. He is set up to deal with the complex audio situation. If you call 610-616-3208, 610-616-3208, he will answer. If you are beyond the United States, outside the United States, you can try by Skype. Just search for our username, ModPo Pen, 2 N's on pen, ModPo Pen, and select the audio call option, and you can talk to us that way. The 4 artworks, and what I thought we'd do is I just throw it out there and I kind of go around for first impressions about any of the 4. We have Dorothea Lange's 2 of her many, many photographs. One is called White Angel Breadline. It's really her first or maybe first significant photograph that she took outside the studio. It's a big deal. Zach Cardner, I should have set this up earlier. Are you able to give us a look at that photograph? I think I sent you them. And if not, Sarah, I'm sure can pick up the catalog.
Yes. Well, you don't have them on hand? I wonder, okay, hold on 1 second. I feel as if you give me a second, why don't we go to the first poem? I can pull it up and then maybe share my screen. Would that work? Okay. So let me give me
in a
1
minute,
second. And then
take your time, Sarah. In a minute, we're going to look at White Angel Breadline. And the second of the Lange photographs is Calipatria, California. Calipatria is a little town in the far southeast corner of California, very hot, very dry. That's a somewhat later photograph. Roughly to go along with White Angel Breadline, we picked Edwin Rolfe's Season of Death, which is more of a standard lyric and more of a narrative poem than we do in ModPo, but it fits in ModPo's Week 5, The Communist Poets. Indeed, Rolfe was a communist. And Gwendolyn Brooks' Boy Breaking Glass, which a number of us have been heard to say sometimes is either the most amazing and best poem in ModPo or one of them. It is an extraordinary poem that we've talked about a lot. So those are the 4. Are you ready to share?
I am. I mean, I'm not, I would say I'm not an expert screen sharer, but let me give this a go. I will, Here is White Angel Breadline.
Oh, there you go. Okay, great.
So that gives you a little sense of that. And I wonder what will happen if I just click to my next tab. Can you now? Oh my gosh, there you go.
Yeah, so that's Calipatria, California. And before we turn to Sarah Meister to give us a little bit of background on these 2 Lange photos, we're going to do kind of a close look at them. I wonder if I could call on a few folks to just give us first impressions of the first one, Sarah. So that's White Angel Breadline. I'd like to start with Amaris, then go to Gabe, and then to Tasha Lutek, just to get your first impressions of what you see when you see this photograph. So Amaris, you want to start?
Yeah, what strikes me, of course, is the sense of isolation. We're looking at the backs of heads of most of these men. And the one in the forefront, he's looking down, so we don't even get a sense of individuality or pride. His head is tucked into his collar. He's just waiting. There's also the passive nature of the photo and how close they are together, the lack of mobility, movement, freedom. He's confined by the situation that he finds himself in.
Yeah, confined. He seems to be stuck against that railing. I mean, maybe he's pressured against that railing because of the crowd, or maybe he's just turned away. Thank you, Amaris. Gabe, your thoughts on this, first impressions?
Yeah, I'm maybe contradicting what Amaris just said, but one of the things I appreciate about this photograph is the way that it shows this kind of mass of people, the sheer volume of people affected and seeking breadline food, but it still has this way in which one person kind of stands out. So it individuates someone to a degree in this mass, which, you know, for a photographer like Lang, who's so interested in like humanizing a crisis or documenting a crisis, this feels like a really effective version of that.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Gabe. Tasha, what are your first thoughts? You know this photograph pretty well, but what would your
I do, but if I'm just responding to it at an emotional level, I mean, I do feel a sense of confinement with this figure. And what's striking is there's all these people around him and all of their backs are turned to them. It's like there's help nearby, but it's inaccessible in some way.
Yeah, that's really great. It's almost, you can see the man, I think he's got a mustache and maybe no beard, is looking at us. Seems to be, yeah, there he is. He seems to be aware that the photographer is documenting the moment. Either that or he's aware of the isolation of this person because it was triangulated by the fact that it's being taken as a photograph. Sarah Meister, can you give us a little mini background, some context for this photograph?
Sure. So leading up into the time when Lang made this photograph, she had operated a commercial photo studio where she had wealthy private clients who came in and had their portraits made by her. But by early 1933, she had a sense that what was happening on the streets around her in San Francisco was more important for her. And, you know, and she ventured out with her camera. According to legend, this is the first time that she photographed that she made about 6 exposures. This was the first photograph she made on the streets. And I find it remarkable, you know, that I agree he is both in a crowd and isolated and penned in both by human figures and these diagonal lines that not only that separate us as viewers from him. And I think, to me, those railings serve a very important purpose. This picture came into the museum's collection in 1940. So before we even had a formal department of photography, this photograph was one of the first pictures given to the museum by a San Francisco-based collector. And just the breadline to which the title refers was run by a woman who was known as the White Angel. And I think, you know, I would love to talk about this with the poem and also think about the words that she chose for the title together as a group as well.
Right. Thank you, Sarah. We'll definitely return to that. I just want to make a comment about this photo and this event of ours, and then ask Kate, Lily, and Amber Rose if they wouldn't mind commenting on my comment. And you can take it any way you want. I did a lot of staring at this photo when we thought about, given the racist murders by police of George Floyd and so many others before that, bringing to the fore issues that either do or don't relate to what we had planned some time ago to talk about the artwork. In this session, I stared at this a long time, and I came to the realization that because Lang was learning at this moment to focus on what she called the deprived and the dislocated, this of course is the Great Depression, because she never really, or very rarely, called herself an artist. She thought about making photographs to affect social change. That's a phrase that Sarah Meister uses in description, but I think it might as well be a quotation from Lang. And because of the way in which she focuses on precarity and isolation, in relation to the poems that we're looking at, it struck us that we should do this session in light of systemic discrimination and racism and the othering of people who are, in her terms, deprived and dislocated. In this case, racial justice is not particularly evident right away. It's in there somewhere, but the next photograph more so. So I wonder if I can call on, and we can, Zach, go to the gallery view again. I wonder if Lily, Kate, and Amber Rose would like to say something about what they've seen in these photographs and poems that either support my thought that we should have this discussion, or not, or cast doubt on it. So Lily, do you want to start? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess, like I'm always in favor of having a conversation. And I feel like when we get together, we have a lot to talk about. I think like one reason I was excited to have this conversation was I've seen a lot of people making comparisons between the Great Depression and our current moment of mass unemployment. And I was interested to think about like ways that the Great Depression was very different from now and ways it was similar. And then I also think, like, regardless of if this feels like the most expedient and relevant topic to police murder and police brutality, I do think the themes and ideas of documenting and looking and trying to make art in a difficult time are still relevant.
Lily, can I ask you just to follow up quickly, and then we'll turn to Kate. There's something that what Sarah Meister has taught us about this photograph is that this marks the turn from indoor art, studio art, to the street. And so many of the photographs talk about what's happening in the street. There's something about, we have a poem in ModPo, Genevieve Taggart's communist poem, which criticizes either a liberal centrist or a conservative who's in her room. It's called Interior, I believe. And that poem is about people in the street calling her to come out, and she's too busy brushing her hair or something. Lang here is out. She's come outside in a way. Does that strike you as relevant to some of the concerns that we have right now about what we should do and where we should be?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think so. And I think it's important to also talk about, why she was inside to begin with, maybe, and also how she got outside, and what she did once she got out. And then, I mean, a lot of really interesting conversation with regards to photography that I'm seeing in our current moment is having fast forwarded to surveillance technology and like different ideas about who has a right to make protest art and who is in danger of surveillance. So that could be an interesting topic too.
Maybe we'll turn to Sarah Meister after we hear from Kate and Amber Rose, because the end of Sarah's course, the MOOC, looks at the contemporary situation where everyone has the means of creating a documentary photograph. And it's really a challenge to your work, Sarah and Tasha, but also an explosive possibility. And it really sort of underscores the decision by Dorothea Lange to think of herself as not as a photojournalist, but as someone making photographs to enact social change, which is really what people do with even the most beautiful photographs now. Kate Colby, your thoughts on this topic?
One thing for me that echoes between these photos and what we're seeing, the images we're seeing in media currently it just made me think about how so often only in moments of emergency are we willing to let go of this deeply ingrained American ethos of individuality. And the way that Lange has obscured the eyes or allowed the eyes to be obscured in these photos, and the way, and this is a very contemporary comment, but the way we see people's faces obscured marching on TV now, and the way the obscuring of the face, assists in this feeling of collectivity and togetherness really struck me, or common cause, I guess.
Really, really great point. Amber Rose, your thought on this topic, or whatever direction you want to take it?
Yeah, I've appreciated the comments so far. I think I'm thinking back with some of the things that Lily said and your original question, Al, about the usefulness of having this kind of discussion. And it made me think about Baraka, actually. And even though this is a poem that packs a lot more in it that must be addressed, I think about the poem when he's talking about what he wants poems to do in the world. And we've talked a lot in ModPo about the kind of slipperiness of that, and not believing necessarily that poems are going to jump out into the world and do something, but like Lily said, the kind of conversation that they can incite is really important. And as for the photos and how they relate, something that I'm thinking a lot about is this language of the weather, and how weather and environment comes through in the black and white of these photos, how the black and white sets a whole kind of tone. And I'm thinking about what's happening now and how it's sort of a weather, it's an environment of violence and dispossession more than any one of these individual events. And thinking about the weather of these photos and the kind of racial violence that is coloring everything that we see in the frame. It might not be right there, but it's in that environment. Yeah.
Thank you, Amber Rose. Sarah, I wonder if what we're going to do is I'm going to say the phone number again, so people can start calling us if they like. You do have a person on the phone? Okay, so whoever, let's put the person on who's on the phone, but then I'm going to turn to Sarah and then we'll take the question. Who is on the phone, Chris?
Hi, Al. We have a ModPo veteran, 5-year veteran on the phone. We have Veronica Charf Garcia from Italy calling.
Oh, wonderful. Veronica, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Hi, 5 years of ModPo. That's really cool. Italy's kind of a Italy's kind of a sister nation in the pandemic, for sure. Anyway,
yeah, we were here in.
Go ahead.
Here in Bergamo, Bergamo was a bit of an epicenter, but I actually started with ModPo in Lima, Peru, in South America. So it's been really exciting over these years to be involved. And I'm really excited that MoMA people are involved today.
MoMA ModPo, ModPo MoMA, I love it. Veronica, what we're going to do is we're going to hear from Sarah Meister a little bit. She wasn't quite ready for this. I just sprung it on her, but this whole issue at the end of her course about the issue that Lily and others have raised about suddenly photography really is social documentation aiming toward change because the people who make the photos are thinking about that. Do you want to comment on that? It's a giant topic for you.
Yeah, it is a giant topic. I would say maybe what I would do, you don't need to do that, it's okay. Sorry, my daughter's, anyway. You don't need to do that now. I think what I would say is right now, unlike past moments in the history of photography where somehow the omnipresence of cameras was seen as a threat. People wanted to, beginning in the 1890s when the Kodak #1 camera was introduced, and the theme from Kodak was you push the button, we do the rest. And for photographers who took what they were doing seriously, who wanted to be understood as artists, that was perceived as a serious threat. And they needed to say, no, what we're doing is not what all of those other people holding cameras are doing. And again, in the 1920s, when the Leica camera was introduced and things were handheld and more mobile, that was the way in which photographers sought to differentiate themselves as artists, as opposed to practitioners with a purpose. And it was one of the reasons, I think, why Lang, at the beginning of her career, was very committed to this idea of, she felt even as a studio photographer that she had a job to do. And even though her sense of purpose was really transformed by the world around her, it was once she went out into the street, there was no looking back. She But she thought, she was supporting her family. Her husband was an artist. She had 2 young children. She was a very good studio photographer, but she thought of herself as one of the broad practitioners. And I would say one of the differences that I see now, or at least that I feel now, is that there is an urgency to bringing all of these kinds of photographic engagements into the embrace and serious consideration of art museums. And, now is not the time to be saying, oh, we collect this very small portion of this. And so I think really trying to, and one of the things we've been doing as an institution in the last couple of weeks is to think, how can we do things differently? How can we challenge the categories that we had previously held that upheld these systemically at heart racist principles about how art history was constructed and so I personally I feel as if now is a wonderful time when everyone has a camera, when photography serves an essential role in capturing things so that everyone can understand the urgency of examining our presumptions from the ground up. I'm glad. I mean, it's one of the things I love about seeing through photographs in general. The course is designed around saying, how can we, now that everyone is a photographer, how do we understand the differences between what I do on my phone and what the modern day equivalent of Dorothea Lange might be. But in recent days, I've actually been thinking maybe we should tease that apart more broadly and really think, let's try to understand how these things relate and not necessarily how we differentiate between them.
Fascinating. I'm using the gallery view, and I see so many people in this discussion sort of resonating with what you just said. Veronica, are you still on? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah, I'm here.
Great. Do you have a comment or question for us? And then we'll ask you to hang up and listen through YouTube, and
Right.
we'll get another caller.
Yeah, I do. I kind of, I'm thinking about what was just said, and that also photographs are so easy to alter now, and so effectively, they can be so, completely perhaps false. And I'm wondering, how can we maintain or search for an idea of truth? And I guess Dorothea Lange was working with the idea of witnessing and commenting, and I wonder if some photographs are just compelling because they're kind of attractive and beautiful, and whether we can just have harsh documentary street level photographs as still being important and ending up in museums. So that's all I have to say.
Such a great question, and gets at the whole problem of the aesthetics of documentary art. Veronica, thank you for.
Can I respond a little bit just for 1 second to that? Because I do want to also just question whether, Dorothea Lange understood that that White Angel breadline is a documentary photograph, and that it's capturing a moment, an environment, as Amber Rose put so beautifully, at the weather, or, of the circumstance. But I think she also understood that its effectiveness depended on aesthetic criteria. How do the highlights of the picture draw your eye around it? So it is true that I think some of the pictures being made today are less aesthetically effective, and that when something works, both in terms of its composition and in terms of its content, that's how you really get some traction on it. I think in the end, the best photographs will be the ones that endure on aesthetic levels and other levels. I just think we need to sort of question how we define quality and things like that. And in terms of truth, I would say, weirdly, the stakes of truth in photography have been contested since the 19th century. Photography is one of my colleagues at the Met did a show called Faking It, manipulation in photography before Photoshop. And photography's truth value has always been challenged and should and will continue to be. And that's another thing I love about it. Actually.
Thank you, Sarah. Veronica, I'm going to turn to Max and Camara and Tasha for responses broadly to your question or the issues it raised. I should have warned you guys ahead of time, but I'm going to do that. But I'm going to ask you to hang up so somebody else can call. And thank you for joining us for 5 years. And I hope you're back. You'll be back with us in September. That'll be great. Thanks for calling.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Cheers.
Be well.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe. Okay.
Bye-bye.
So Max, Camara, and Tasha, I'm going to construe whatever you say as being able to lead us to Edwin Rolfe's poem. Actually, I think what Sarah said just now made me think of it, because Rolfe saw himself as a documentary poet, even though it's a very flowy narrative storytelling poem. It was meant to be a kind of photograph of a situation. We won't spend a huge amount of time on Rolfe, but it does resonate with what Amber Rose said, because it's also about the winter. It's also about the season of death.
Is someone going to read it, though? I just worry that maybe not all. Okay, great.
Yeah, I'll read it when we get there. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so Max, Camara, and Tasha, any thoughts on what Veronica asked or that issue?
Well, Veronica brought up the issue of deep fakes, which I think Sarah started to speak to very well, and that's a whole can of worms, as they say. But I was thinking Sarah's earlier comment about the Kodak tagline early on about how you push the button and we do the rest got me thinking a little bit about the labor involved, not only in photography, but I guess in the act of documenting, and how there is, as Kodak was pushing, and I think in the minds of lots of would-be documenters, there's this idea that the recording device will capture the situation, the crisis, the event as it is, without necessarily thinking of all of the potential labor that goes into documenting, whether it's being out on the street as Lang was, or whether it's thinking about things like composition or the way that a viewer will receive this image. And I think that's one way to start thinking a little bit about the difference between these Lang photos and I think the outpouring of media and photographic evidence we've gotten in the last couple of weeks of what's been happening around the country. That there is this kind of attention to composition. there is this attention to the form and what she's photographing, that there's a kind of artistry that is not necessarily, that I wouldn't call artifice. It's not exactly cutting against the reality of the situation she's trying to document, but rather is part of leading us into the truth of the situation. That there's this way of kind of narrating the situation and the conditions of the situation that involves a little bit of work or artistic choice on the part of the documenter.
Thank you, Max. That was great. Camara, take this anywhere you like.
Oh, I will, Al. Thank you. Yeah, the conversation that Max brought up about labor, I think we can also throw in power into the conversation. And what I've been thinking about during this conversation is sort of who gets to be safe behind the camera, and who is in danger behind the camera when picking up the camera, when learning about photography, during the process of taking the photos, but also afterwards. And I don't know, it just brought up a series of more questions for me about that in terms of safety and danger inside of the construction site outside my apartment building. And that's just what sort of I've been thinking about, specifically in relation to Boy Breaking Glass, which I know we'll get to later.
We will get to it, in fact, soon. Boy, but maybe we can anticipate, given what you just said, I'll throw something out that will be a topic for that part of the conversation. what we have in Lang in this early photo is this important moment where she chose, for whatever reason, whether it was a liberal sense of alliance with people who are suffering the precarities of the Depression, a sense of guilt, which I think she probably felt in doing all this elite social photography in the studio. She was, after all, an apprentice. She had to make some money in the studio. That was the way to do it. This was such a breakthrough. And so this is the kind of ambiguous place of a person who can retreat to safety coming out. I wouldn't say there's risk in the first photograph or even in the second one, but she's out there and she's putting herself out there. And we have, Sarah wants to add to this, which is great. We have so many things we have to ask about the subjectivity, the subject position, which we're not used to doing. Most people who deal with art just casually aren't thinking about it. One thing we do in our poetry classes, we're constantly thinking about the subject position. So you raise a really compelling issue. Sarah, can you comment quickly on this? And then I want to turn to Tasha.
I would love to get back to it in terms of the subjects, but for Lang, for this picture, she actually had her brother with her when she went out. She had a bulky camera that was on a tripod. And just to quote her, she recalled, "I was just gathering my forces, and that took a little bit because I wasn't accustomed to jostling about in groups of tormented, depressed, and angry men with a camera." And so I think really thinking about this question of who is safe in front of the camera, absolutely, and for photographers, to bring it back to also what Max is saying in terms of labor, I love to think through this more with all of you. So Thank you. That's an excellent point.
That what you just quoted responds so well to Camara's question.
That was why I was waving.
Tasha, we'll return to you, but I see in Christopher Martin's face that there might be someone on the phone. Am I wrong?
No, you are absolutely right, Al. Are you ready for the call?
I'd like to bring the person in, but still turn to Tasha and then bring the poem in. But yes, let's say hello to whoever it is.
Okay, well, this is actually a really cool combo. We have Chris calling from New York City, who found the webcast through MoMA, but is actually a poet himself. So if this isn't a more perfect event for Chris, I don't know what is.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, Chris, can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
That's great. So you're interested in you're in the MoMA course, you're interested in MoMA, you saw the announcement, and you're a poet, so you should be a ModPo person. You are now a ModPo person, I would say.
Oh, great, I am.
What we're going to do is I'm going to ask you to pause, hang on, stay on the line and listen to us. We're going to turn to the first poem after we hear a little bit from Tasha about the issue that just got raised. I'm going to read the poem and you'll be one of those who can respond, initially to it. All right, Chris?
Great, thanks.
Great. Tasha, where do you want to take this?
Well, I just wanted to comment on Veronica's mention of truth, which Sarah spoke about a bit as well, and it is something that we've questioned forever in photography. But I just wanted to comment, I guess, as a collections manager, the things that are on my mind, that photographs aren't really neutral. And I think that our visual literacy is so high at this point that we can question, what's in the camera, what's absent from the camera. And then from my end, me and my colleagues are thinking a lot about our responsibilities and how we catalog and present something. And something as simple as a caption can direct the way you experience an image, or cropping and things like that. So we're trying to think long-term about what our responsibilities are to how we share information, understanding it's not neutral, and how we can represent that complexity in a database, for instance.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tasha. I'm going to read Edwin Rolfe's Season of Death, and I'll turn to several of you, Amaris, Gabe, and Amber Rose, for initial responses to the poem, and also to Chris, who's on the line. I promise we're not going to spend a lot of time on Rolfe, because I think we want to get to the second photo, which is more germane to our current situation, and also the second poem, the Brooks poem, which is also more germane. But I'm going to read it. It's a kind of a smushy poem, and I can't say that I love it ultimately, but every time I read it, I get pretty emotional, because It's the sixth winter of the Great Depression. The unemployment rate where Rolf was when he wrote this poem was about 35%. People were really starving. They were really destitute. One of the things that the Communist Party of the United States of America, CPUSA, was working on was to prevent evictions. And so one of the things they did is when they heard about an eviction, they would go to the site of eviction. They'd physically prevent it from happening. So Rolf was very much part of that political action. He wanted to tell a story of what it's like to live on the street at that time. So Season of Death. So the sixth winter would be 1935. You just have to count the years of the Depression. This is the sixth winter. This is the season of death, when lungs contract and the breath of homeless men freezes on restaurant window panes. Men seeking the sight of rare food before the head is lowered into the upturned collar and the shoulders hunched and the shuffling feet move away slowly, slowly disappear into a darkened street. This is the season when rents go up. Men die, and their dying is casual. I walk along the street returning at midnight from my unit. Unit is a reference to his communist cell. It's a political reference. He's had a meeting. I walk along the street returning at midnight from my unit. Meet a man leaning against an illumined wall and ask him for a light. His open eyes stay fixed on mine, and cold rain falling trickles down his nose, his chin. Buddy, I begin, and look more closely and flee in horror from the corpse's grin. The eyes pursue you even in sleep, and when you awake, they stare at you from the ceiling. You see the dead face peering from your shoes. The eggs at Thompson's are the dead man's eyes. Work dims them for 8 hours, but then the machine's silent, they appear again. Along the docks, in the terminals, in the subway, on the street, in restaurants. The eyes are focused from the river among the floating garbage that other men fish for, their hands around poles, almost in prayer, wanting to live, who also soon will stand, propped by death against a stone cold wall. We're going to turn to Amaris, Gabe, Amber Rose, and Chris on the phone for just quick first reactions, first responses to that poem. Anything you like. Gabe, you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. For me, something that's like one of the interesting moments in it is the kind of the issue of labor returns sort of post this traumatic event, right? So that like you have this moment where Rolf Speaker says that the eyes, the like memory of this traumatic corpse go away during a workday. And once the machines of work go silent, they come back. But at the same time, you have this other moment where the eggs, which is a product of somebody's labor, are also the eyes. So it's got this really unsteady relationship to the work, to income, and to sort of what we might call making ends meet.
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. And also there's a doubling of the work because mostly his work was working for the communist unit, and he had a job, which was a labor job, machine job. So he has two kinds of work. And is he doing the work of political change when he's asking for a light and then realizes that the man he asked a light for, which is supposedly non-work, turns into a feeder of his work emotionally and otherwise. Gabe, thank you so much. Amber Rose, can we turn to you for a quick response to this?
Yeah, I have two thoughts. The first thing that I want to say actually is, again, about the weather, because I think this poem also sort of has an environment. And I just want to recognize that metaphor, that theoretical gift, is from Christina Sharp's work, her work in the wake. I see a lot of people talking about it on Twitter and YouTube, so I just want to point you to her work. And to say that she uses the weather to talk about the climate of anti-Blackness under which everything else is happening. And so that is present too in this poem. And thinking about that, the two lines that stick out for me are, "This is the season when rents go up, men die, and their dying is casual." And then at the end, the repetition of wanting to live. Yeah. And I'm thinking about all of those things kind of compressed together. Thinking today about landlord strikes and not having money and rent still going up, and the compression of that with a deathliness that becomes casual, and what it means for those that are dying, for those that are mourning, and for those that are able to live next to that deathliness. And then I think that repetition, wanting to live, and then in italics, wanting to live. I'm hearing so many voices that are saying that alongside, and that echo is just sort of, moving in me right now.
Thank you, Amber Rose. Thank you so much for that comment. Amaris next, and then Chris, who's I hope still on the phone. Chris, who probably had a question he wanted to ask, is going to wind up being asked to comment on this poem, but that's the way things go. Amaris, your thought on this poem?
Yeah, I was also struck by the image of the dead eyes, particularly to put that in conversation with the Dorothea Lange photograph, where we see there are no eyes in those photos. The eyes are downcast if we see a face at all. And I see that as dead in the sense of, unseeing, and unseen because these men don't see a way forward. There's a loss of agency. Of course, there's the literal death. The dying is casual because statistically men were dying from hunger across the nation. But there's also perhaps significantly also a death of dignity, a death of self-worth that, like we were saying before, is so key to the American ethos of individuality. And, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but what if the situation leaves you completely helpless and unable to do that? And I think it's interesting that in the first photograph we're talking about, in the breadline photograph, that's before the New Deal kicked in and government aid was available to these men, but they're still left just waiting in this very static image, begging for help. So the action that's available to them through labor, through work that would allow them to feel some sorts of pride has been taken from them. Whereas in the second photograph, they are waiting for relief checks. But again, it's that static image where no action is possible, no sense of individual pride and work is possible. And the Edwin Rolfe poem also ends in this static image of just standing propped against a stone cold wall. So I think the three pieces work really, really well in conversation with each other.
You're so right. You're retroactively confirming the choice of Season of Death to go along with these two Lange photos, that standing against the wall, waiting, useless. Chris, you're still there. We're putting you on the spot after just meeting you for the first time. Sorry. Do you want to say anything about the poem? I don't know if you have the text in front of you or you just had to hear it from me.
No, what I would say is what interested me, in addition to all the wonderful comments that were already made, was the significance of the vivid imagery in the poem and the vivid imagery in the photographs, and the perspective of the photographer and the perspective of the poet as people of some level of privilege, looking at something, at people who did not enjoy that privilege, and being moved to want to memorialize and keep themselves awake to the advantage that they have been given and the plight of those who are not as lucky as they are. And that just felt so contemporary. And especially at this moment when there are so many people who slowly, but at least that's coming around, are beginning to acknowledge and become aware of their own privilege as they address and admit to the inequities that exist in our culture, and the hope I think that people take in watching this unfold, in that, like the NFL as an example, who were so sadly responsive to Colin Kaepernick's protests a long time ago, now apologizing and saying they were wrong. I think about that journey in the same way that Dorothea Lange made the journey from her studio to the street of people of privilege, of which I am one, begin to become aware of that larger scope, and not everybody else has that same privilege.
Chris, that was such a great comment. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to follow up briefly, and then we'll ask you to hang up and listen to the rest on YouTube, and we'll get another caller in, and then we're going to turn to the second photograph. So Sarah Meister, get ready to put that, share that screen. My question to you is about eyes and subjectivity. There's kind of a ever since Romantic poetry cliche that if you have a subject, that is to say, a speaker or narrator, and I'd actually like to ask Kate Colby to comment on this as well, if she wants to. That you have a subjectivity that sometimes in a first-person poem turns into the I. In this case, I think the I is sort of very closely related to what Rolf does, and maybe it is Rolf. And the fact that you have an I, and that I, capital letter I, is looking into the eyes, seeing an other. And that I, we hope, becomes a subjectivity. The I of the other becomes a subjectivity, and you have intersubjectivity. The problem with situations like this crisis, the crisis of the depression in these two artworks, is that everybody's so downcast and the weather's shitty, that we can't see their eyes. It was said by people who study the Holocaust, study genocide, that it's very hard to kill someone when you see their eyes, harder than if you don't. I think that it was Terence Dupre who said that. I think that's probably true, but I think we're also discovering that it doesn't matter ultimately. People who are looking at you can still be killed if there's enough hate in you. And if you're creating an artwork and you are an overwhelming subjectivity, it's your camera or your pen, it almost doesn't matter whether you can see their eyes. In this case, Rolf is struggling as the person of privilege to see the eyes everywhere, right? But I wonder if Dupre was wrong, that it takes a whole lot more than to just show the eyes of an other to keep them from dying. I kind of loaded a lot on you, Chris, and I'm sorry for that. But do you have anything to say in response? Since you're a poet, you think about
my thought in response to what you were saying is that maybe that's one of the differentiating features between an artist capturing a photograph or a poet capturing a moment in poetry, and someone who is documenting well-intentioned, moved, etc. In that, I think when a Dorothea Lange captures an image, both calculated and inspired, the resulting image doesn't require anything other than whether it has eyes in the picture or not, to be impactful. And I think that would be what defines an artist. Whereas maybe the same picture taken by me, if I was standing there and was moved to take it, would not be as impactful. That's the only thing I can think of.
That's lovely. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for calling. Thanks for being Thanks for being a prospective ModPoer. Thanks so much. So you're going to hang up and watch the rest of this. The number is 610-616-3208. I wanted to turn to Kate, but Gabe had a process suggestion that I saw in the chat, but I didn't get to read it. What was your suggestion, Gabe?
Didn't come from me, actually. It was actually that I was just responding to Amber Rose. Mm-hmm. Amber Rose, do you want to bring up the question you got on YouTube?
Yeah, I got a question from David, somebody, I can't find his last name, but a question from David about how the poems were selected to pair with these Lang photos, and if there are any other poems that were considered or could be considered next to these for further reading.
Wow, such a great question. Can we all just popcorn this? Everybody throw out some suggestions that seemed to work. What happened is I had picked what was it that I picked for the second poem? Anybody remember? I can't remember.
I think it was interior that you picked.
Interior, right. So that whole question of a middle-class person inside her house with people in the streets calling upon her to come out, that's really relevant. But it struck me that we needed something else. So what were some of the other suggestions? Baraka's incident was one suggestion, right? Any others? Unmute thyself and tell.
In ModPo, we cover communist poets of the moment who tend to be pretty underread just as far as canons go. But so that's a unit that we were really sourcing from, if I remember correctly, in our discussions. One that came up as a possible alternative that we're not talking about that I think Lily suggested is Kenneth Fearing's Green Light, which is a great poem.
It is a great poem. And Sarah Meister started this by saying, we'd like to team up with you. Do you have some poems? And we thought of social poetry, so-called, of the Depression. That's really the answer to the question. But I think that—
Can I just add, I actually was quite uncomfortable with the pairing of the Rolf and the Lang. Based on this conversation, I'm glad you overruled me. But to me, I was very concerned that the photograph was going to be read as an illustration of the poem. And what I admire so much about hearing all of your comments about the poem is the way that you're able to pull things from it that transcend. I mean, I guess, Al, you were confident this would happen. So my fear was unfounded. But I think it's interesting. I have this instinctive sort of protective feel that I don't want photographs to be seen as illustrations of ideas that are expressed in other media.
Yeah.
And there's such a tendency in photography to lean on subject matter and what you see as the beginning and end of its meaning. Yes. Whereas, in fact, one of the things we do in Seeing Through Photographs is really try to tease those apart. How is a subject? And you guys have just really, I'm grateful, and you've really done. So I would just say to the question that Amber Rose mentioned from the YouTube chat, I really was pushing against this pairing, and I'm glad that you overruled me.
Well, I'm sorry, I was perceived to have overruled.
I mean,
but let me just say this: we fight the same fight. That is to say, photographs seem to a lot of people to be about content. Well, what's it about? What's being depicted? Poetry, too often, is like, what's it about? And ModPo, and it sounds like you guys at MoMA have the same problem, we're all about teaching people that if you look at the language, you look at the subject position, you look at the form, you look at all these things that are not content, that's how the content gets delivered. How a poem says what it says is more important than what it says. I mean, I was very confident that that would come out. Kate, I wanted to turn to you, and now the moment might have been lost, but I'm sure you have a thought. And then what I want to do is look at the next photograph and the Brooks poem together. Brooks not illustrating by any means anything like that photograph, but they will lead us to a really interesting conversation about our current moment. Kate, any thought at all? You're muted, Kate.
So sorry.
All right.
To return to the original topic you assigned me about eyes and their role as Amaris, and you were pointing out, I see in both the photographs and the Rolf, the artists resisting or working counter to the romantic idea of eyes as windows on the soul, and into poverty, and working against that trope in order to generalize suffering and poverty among these people in this time. But I do think they're also rendering them rabble in a way, by denying them their eyes and their individuality. And it put me in mind, and I don't want to widen the scope necessarily, but you did ask about other reading. I could not help constantly referring back to Whitman when regarding all of this work, and this sort of anti-Whitmanian horror of the rabble you see here, rather than this celebration of America singing and the all the people coming together, being one in this nation.
I just want to put a pin in that so that when we get to Boy Breaking Glass, we can remember to talk about this. There are two thoughts about the crowd. There is, as per Sarah Meister and others thinking about today's multiplicity of documentary photographs, there is this idea that we can crowdsource evidence that leads to justice. We can crowdsource seeing many different videos from many different angles often that actually has an effect on prosecution, right? So we think of the crowd as a potentially freedom-loving and freedom-making. We also have this fear at the moment of the crowd. It's not just on the right that there's a fear of this. The fear of the rabble, the fear of crowd is all over poets, certainly, who come out of the Romantic tradition, which is all about the individual doing the seeing, and the crowd is a little scary. So we have that doubleness. What I would like to do is I'm going to ask Max, Lily, and Camara, and Tasha to respond after Sarah Meister shows us the second photograph, just to respond initially to that photograph, and then I'll ask someone, maybe Amber Rose would be willing to read the Brooks poem. Would you be willing to perform it for us? And then we'll put those both into play. So Sarah's sharing the screen. Go ahead, Sarah, tell us a little bit about.
I just want to mention though that Tasha has to go at noon, so if she could speak first, I would, and then she has to wave goodbye. So I'll put up the photo and then let you handle it. But
thank you.
Can you see it? Is the screen visible?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry that I do have another meeting at noon, so I have to leave.
Okay. Do you want to say something first about this? Sure.
I mean, I guess my first impression to this image is always, what is the crowd gathering for? What are they looking at? It's such a large crowd, and there's this sort of small window, and what can be happening that's bringing them together. So what I like about this photograph is that it immediately raises all these questions for me, and kind of prompts you to ask and seek that information. But I just wanted to say this was a really lovely event, and thank you, Al, for pointing out that poetry and photography have a special relationship, and we do fight the same fight. So thank you all for letting me be included. I really enjoyed listening to your comments and
thank you, Tasha. Tasha,
thank you, Tasha, so much.
Thank you very much.
See you later.
Sarah Meister, you want to tell us a little bit about this photograph?
Sure. As Tasha was saying, Lang leaves it somewhat ambiguous, so that they are gathered around a relief window where some sort of assistance is being given out. This was made while Lang was working for the Farm Security Administration, which was a government agency. So unlike, and I think one of the things that we could talk about that would be interesting is in the 1930s in particular, when were governments actually supporting photographers and poets and writers? And I think that would be something I'd like to return to later. So Lang was an employee of the federal government at this point. I'm struck by the women in this picture, by the mixed races. We did in the book, we use this as the beginning of the plate section. I love it that much. And there we combine it with these words this is Lang talking about making another picture. Actually, she was specifically speaking about making White Angel Breadline, but I think it applies across her practice. And she writes, You know there are moments such as these when time stands still and all you do is hold your breath and hope it will wait for you. And you just hope you will have enough time to get it organized in a fraction of a second on that tiny piece of sensitive film. Sometimes you have an inner sense that you have encompassed the thing generally. You know then that you are not taking anything from anyone, their privacy, their dignity, their wholeness. And I think that idea of when eyes are covered or backs are turned or anonymity is preserved is one way of her expressing a signal of respect for the privacy of the people that she's photographing.
What a great setup. Thank you, Sarah. So I wanted to call on Lily, Max, and Camara to comment further on your first response to this. Lily, do you want to start?
Sure. I think to me, the most, like, my first impressions are to notice the similarities in everyone's stance, like all the people in the photograph. There seem to be like a set, I don't know, like a set group of postures, like hands in pockets, hands on hips. I'm just thinking about how a photograph can convey the idea of waiting, because like waiting happens in real time, but a photograph is an instant moment. And you can really see the length of time that these people have been here, even though it's just one instant captured.
Yes, great, fantastic. That is absolutely good. Camara, your thought on this?
Yeah, what strikes me in this photo of first impressions are the contrast between like the geometry of like the windows or the doors and the like somewhat fluidness of the heads of people versus and the shadows. And the shadows specifically like have me thinking, going off of what Amber Rose was talking about with the weather and sort of the environment. The shadows makes me think that something is, you know, the sun or something is affecting the growth of the shadow, but also gets this feeling that there's more than what we see, that there's this effect that's longer than what we see here. And also, yeah, it seems like there's a Black man in the center. It's hard to, the anonymity of it, the faces turned makes you not be able to see, but there's clearly a multiracial crowd, and it seems like the darkest skinned person is in the sort of center of the frame all the way in the back, and that struck out to me as well. Do
you think, Camara, we don't have evidence of this except our intuition, but she must have taken several shots of this, but this is the one that centered the Black man, who's also looking aside. The others are all looking to the window. How funny question to ask, but you'll interpret it benignly, I'm sure, because we talk about intention with at risk. But this was the intention to center this Black man. Yes, pretty important.
Yeah, I'd say.
Yeah. So what do you think is the consequence of that? Because it's somewhat integrated, but not maybe as much. You have to really work hard to see how integrated a group it is.
Yeah. I think that, I think that it is intentional, or at least the consequence of that for me is seeing that although that there is this crowd and the shadow makes it feel like there's this impending and growing or more than we can see crowd, there's still this Black man who's in, for us, closest to the camera, but farthest in the back from the line.
Yeah.
Which seems to be making a historical point.
I wanted to thank you. I want to turn to Max, but Max, let me just start this by saying I can't, because we're in a moment where we get in lines and we space out when we're doing anything retail or commercial right now because of the pandemic. But when we go to a protest, we might be trying to space out, but we're not in a line. We're in a group. There's a tension here. You have this feeling like they should probably be in a line if they're getting relief checks, because that would be fair. You have this sense that the Black man who's the centerpiece is furthest away from getting his check, even though he's kind of in line. There's something slightly unfair about the way this is all spaced out. Anyway, that's just a thought. All I could think of is maybe that's the guy who's going to get it last, or not at all. Max, what do you think?
That's an interesting point, Al. I had thought that too, actually, when I first looked at this, wondering why they were not in a line, but I also didn't necessarily know if being fussy about lines was maybe the most important thing when considering this photograph and the situation that these folks find themselves in. But
yeah.
What I wanted to comment on I wanted to start by going back to what Kate said earlier about the eyes and how shielding the eyes is a way of rendering these crowds into a kind of rabble. And I absolutely think that's at play here. But also what I find really striking about this photograph is the way that some faces are offered in like tantalizingly in profile, and you want to try to identify these folks and also potentially identify with them. And I think that's really what's quite brilliant about this photograph. And about on the question of diversity, yes, I was also struck, as Sarah pointed out, by the at least compared to the other photograph we looked at, by the greater representation of gender and race that's happening here. And also, there's many people in the crowd here that we might not be seeing. There's also, very interestingly, like a possible sartorial diversity, that there's different styles and fashions represented here. And maybe somebody who's familiar with the era can talk about this, but it seems like different trades or different professions are being referenced by the clothing here. I mean, there's a man in overalls with a hat. There's another man with a white fedora over to the left, men with these sorts of flat newsboy caps. And I know that the hats, especially at the time, were big indicators of what your station in life was, or what your profession or trade was.
Yeah, Sarah, I want to just add a comment, and then we'll turn to you. And then we're going to get a phone call, and we're going to turn to the poem finally. Calipatria, California is way, way in the southeastern corner, in the middle of that county there. And the average temperature, high temperature in the summer is 107. In the low temperature in the winters, like in the 40s. This is obviously fall or spring. The sun just beats down everything. They get no rain. You can almost tell from the ground. Hats are crucial. You get the feeling that it's also 1937, not 1933. The New Deal has been implicitly, through its economic policies and through the FSA, pushing racial equality as best it can. And you get more integrated scenes of relief by 1937 than you do in 1933. But I can't help going back to Amber Rose's thinking about the seasons and the weather, that the extreme weather makes integration or racism, not at such moments, not as crucial to white racists as it might be in a situation where it isn't 107 degrees. And, just it strikes me that the weather almost makes integration a little easier. I'm just winging it there. Sarah, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I actually, first of all, I just wanted to add, we, in the Lang book for the words and pictures, we had 12 contemporary artists, writers, thinkers, poets, and Christina Sharp was one of them who contributed to this book. So I wanted to, as soon as you said her name, I was like, her decision, she's an incredibly in-demand writer, thinker, and her saying yes to this, to me, signaled a really a sense of what Lang holds, and these pictures hold for all of us as a society. So I just wanted to bring that up. I think one of the things the sartorial observation is a really great one, and there are lots of, this is in February, so this is probably in the cooler months there. I think the variety of the hats and the clothes reflect the diversity of the migrant workers in California, which actually preceded any of the aid that was being offered. So Lang's first work that she did for the state government of California in early 1935, so 2 years before this, was includes this wonderful page from the Library of Congress where she writes, all races serve the crops in California. And so there was a Japanese population, a Filipino population, Mexican workers, African-American workers. And by 1937, the exodus from the Dust Bowl across the United States so you really do, I think, that observation that these people are wearing different kinds of clothes to here gather aid, but in other pictures to work in the fields. Those reflect that wide variety of places that, California was a magnet for all of this, and that promise. And yeah, so
thank you. That's really edifying. Can we go back to the gallery view? Hi. What I'd like to do is, I believe Chris has someone on the line. I'd like to add that friend on the line, then ask Lily just to quote 2 or 3 zippy, fabulous tweets really quickly. We're not going to respond to them, but we'd love to hear a medley of them. Then I'm going to ask Amber Rose to read the Brooks poem. We're going to spend the rest of the time, about 15 minutes, talking about Brooks. So let's get someone on the phone.
Yeah, so I just want to say we've had a lot of people trying to call in, and I can only screen one caller at a time. So I apologize to the many people who weren't able to get through. But thank you to those who did get through, including Allison, who is one of our ModPo friends now, calling from Woodland, California.
Oh, Allison. Hi, Allison. Can you hear me? Hey, thank you for all the work you do for the community, for the ModPo community. You're amazing.
Hey, thanks for a great reading of the Seasons of Death poem.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That poem, I don't love it in the end, but it touches me when I read it. Allison, hold on, if you don't mind. We're going to hear some tweets, and then Amber Rose is going to perform the Brooks, and then we'll let you join us in the conversation about the Brooks. So, Lily, you've got some fun tweets?
Sorry, I stopped my video instead of unmuting my mic. Yeah, a couple of tweets. It's a little quiet in there, but I got to say Sanjeev is really holding it down in the Twitterverse, so thank you, Sanjeev. I really like what he says here. Poetry, the ModPo way, isn't only the what is being said, but the how it is being said. Form is as important as content, Al often says. So not just the content, but how it's framed, what it's telling us, who is taking the photograph. These are important discussions.
Did Twitter allow Sanjeev to write that much?
I know, it's quite long, isn't it? That's so funny. And let me see, our Val Moulton says that Season of Death is a very powerful and moving poem.
Hi, Val in London.
Val.
Hello, Val, we love you.
And our pal Mandana says, thinking about form and content in poetry and composition and content in black and white photography, how they intersect and how diverge.
Mandana got to see the show before the pandemic closed it up, Sarah Meister. So she's in New York. Thank you, Lily. Okay, so Amber Rose is going to read the poem. Then I'm going to invite everybody to briefly comment. We've talked about this poem a lot, but I think now we're talking about it in relationship to the photograph and also to the moment, which is particularly amazing, given the first 2 lines in particular. So Amber Rose, thank you in advance for performing the poem.
Toy Breaking Glass by Gwendolyn Brooks. Whose broken window is a cry of art, success that winks aware as elegance, as treasonable faith, is raw, is sonic, is old-eyed premiere, our beautiful flaw and terrible ornament, our barbarous and metal little man. I shall create, if not a note, a whole, if not an overture, a desecration, full of pepper and light and salt and night and cargoes. Don't go down the plank if you see there's no extension. Each to his grief, each to his loneliness and fidgety revenge. Nobody knew where I was, and now I am no longer there. The only sanity is a cup of tea. The music is in minors. Each one other is having different weather. It was you. It was you who threw away my name, and this is everything I have for me. Who has not Congress, lobster, love, luau, the Regency room, the Statue of Liberty runs, a sloppy amalgamation, a mistake, a cliff, a hymn, a snare, and an exceeding sun.
Damn, that's such a great poem. Thank you, Ambrose. What we're going to do is I'm going to turn to each one of you and to Allison and ask for a thought on this poem. And it will have to double as a final word. It'll be sort of our way to conclude. I'll give Sarah Meister a final word, but just so she can say goodbye to all of her folks, the MoMA people. So say whatever you want to say about this poem, and I will say to people who haven't been doing ModPo, we have 2 or 3 video clips of us talking about this poem. Most recently, Camara joined us in Boston and Cambridge at MIT for, I think we talked about that poem really interestingly. So there's a lot more to say about it, but let's see what happens. So I'm going to start with Gabe, and I would like Amaris to be on deck second after Gabe.
Okay, I think I have a comment that's also a final word. You know, I think I can do it all. So what I want to say is we've been thinking about documentary photography and documentary poetics, which in and of itself assumes that it's trying to capture a moment. That's sort of a phrase we use a lot. So documentary has like this really strong relationship to a now that it's trying to both invent and record. But the kind of 4 objects that we've looked at today are sort of interesting with regards to this now because they're also so much about expectation, about waiting, about a future. In the White Angel Breadline and in Edwin Rolfe's poem, we have an as if in prayer of hands locked around an object that is not religious, but seems to be an expectation of something. And I think that like that's a sort of interesting relationship for documentary poetics to have because it's capturing a waiting for a moment that isn't in the photograph. And I think that Brooks's poem is sort of a little bit of a turn from the other 3 because it's about the kind of moment in which somebody protests their now through an act of making that Brooks is insisting is a making that also gets sort of read as an unmaking or as a breaking. So it's a kind of revolt against one's now. But for Brooks, and I think for a lot of us in this current moment, that kind of revolt against your now feels like fighting for some kind of future, of trying to make a world that is more ethical. That's all.
Gabe, that was everything you said it was going to be. A great final thought and a great new reading of the poem. Thank you, Gabe. We're going to turn to Amaris, followed by Amber Rose.
Yeah, I really love the assertive and dynamic nature of this poem. It's so full of energy and the boy breaking glass taking power back for himself. And as Gabe was saying, revolting against the now of forces that would try to relegate him to invisibility. But he takes action in the way that he can. And I'm particularly struck by the last stanza where we have what seems to me kind of all these symbols of power in a more traditional sense, you know, Congress, governmental power, the lobster, material or luxury, material power, love and so forth, versus the power that he holds up, which is the power of music, of art, and of self-expression.
Thank you, Amaris. That was really wonderful. Amber Rose next, followed by Allison on the phone. I hope she heard me.
Yeah, I love this poem. Is so good. I guess I want to. I was thinking along. What are words? Okay. Thinking alongside Gabe and his comments about protesting the now, and that I agree that this, looking at this poem, feels like a shift. I'm thinking about all of the waiting that was happening in the photographs, and Brooks is talking about a moment when the waiting has gone on too long. I'm thinking about that last stanza. This boy doesn't have Congress. Congress isn't helping. Doesn't have the luxury of lobster. Doesn't have love. Doesn't have the imaginary of American liberty, and is now being asked to move and create something else, to do something else, to disrupt a kind of comfort in lack, and to move into another kind of atmosphere. And I guess my final word is to read this poem again after the webcast ends, and share it with some folks, and think about it, and think about what it means to move. I guess I'm also thinking, Al, about you talking at the beginning about making the choice to go outside. And one of the things that Lily responded and said is, well, what happens when you go outside? That just going outside is not enough, but it's about the actions that continue that continue from that front step.
Amber, as a quick follow-up, then I want to turn to Allison. I have this feeling, because we've talked about this poem before, and we just checked in with each other the other day about things in general. I have a feeling that this poem is inspiring to you, it's a cry of art. It gives a brilliant radical rationale for art as being not just an okay thing to do, but a responsiveness. So my question is, how does it inspire? If it inspires you, how does it, and what do you want to do with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does inspire me, and more than maybe it inspires me to create art myself, it inspires me to look for art in different places. So I'm thinking about, as folks have moved to do more protests, the amount of street art that I'm seeing, and spray painted signs and spray painted images, and folks putting their art on building walls, on buses, on backs of backpacks. And there's so much conflicted conversation about how to interpret what we're seeing. And if we return to Brooks and see it as art, and think about where that push for this kind of art comes from, it can actually help us think about and understand what's happening in a different and crucial light.
Thank you, Ambrose. That was wonderful. Allison, if you can hear me, would you have a thought on the Brooks?
Oh, well, Ambrose, thank you for a wonderful reading and for an even better comment. I mean, it's a tough act to follow, but what I'll say is I keep thinking about when Al opened up this conversation for us about the first photo, and how he said, I know that maybe there isn't race in this photo. And it made me say to myself, well, it's not really what you can see in this photo in that sense, but it's what you can't see. And so much of our conversation right now about race and about the situation in the United States is all of the things that people sort of choose not to see, or the lens or the photos that they take reflect a very specific kind of reality. And I'll just end with saying that, I think you can't divorce race and capitalism in this country from one another. And the first line of this poem, whose broken window is a cry of art, should resonate with every person who has a problem with the destruction of property over the death of people. This is a signal to the world that it's not okay what's going on. Breaking something is an action that demonstrates, like they say, if you're not going to let me create, I'm going to destroy something, in her poem, she says. So I would take that as the lesson that I'm walking away with today.
Thank you, Allison. Radical as always. And one of the things, when you said this, you may have been focusing on what you said and not looking at the gallery view, but I saw Max light up, because I think he shares the same point of view. So I want to turn to Max and then Kate for a thought on Brooks, and then a final thought mixed in.
My final thought on this poem, and I guess our discussion in general, is a little bit inspired by your comments at the beginning of the video discussion that was made for this poem, Al, a few years back, which I had the pleasure of watching earlier today. And also by just having spent the month of May reading Gwendolyn Brooks in my Slopo session, my month-long Slopo session on Brooks. And I've just been thinking about glass as the medium of the sort of like kind brutalist architecture that emerges in the post-war period, and the kind of public space that creates in cities, and how that contrasts with I think the public spaces that are hinted at least in, we don't quite get the full scope of the setting of the Lang photos, but there's a sort of commons that's hinted at, where there's a kind of rabble, potentially a diverse rabble that's allowed to exist, and not necessarily in like nice lines, that there isn't this insistence on order in those spaces. And I'm thinking of downtown Chicago and Chicago in general, which Brooks wrote a lot about. And downtown Chicago it's all very gridded, and it was kind of like rebuilt starting in the 50s and 60s to be like this seemingly hospitable space with different plazas and these like glass international style skyscrapers, but it's in fact like quite hostile because it sort of directs the wind down into public spaces, and it's like it's not always the nicest place to be. There's no sunshine or anything, and it's like it's in fact like quite a hostile space to congregate. So I'm just imagining like Brooks, maybe responding a little bit to the medium of glass and the sort of the power and authority that glass as a medium takes on in the post-war period during these projects of urban renewal.
That's a great reading, Max. It doesn't take much to construe from what you said. The poem is a meta poem about a certain style of civic building that needed to have a couple of bricks thrown at it.
Right.
So
that's strongly implied, I would say.
kind of a style. Thank you, Max, from Chicago. Kate Colby, you're next, and then I'd like for Lily to add her final thought after that.
I wanted to call attention to another meaning for the word art, which is of intention in the sense of artlessness or artfulness, and how the poem immediately in that first line gives agency to the speaker and the committer of this act of breaking glass. And I loved reading it in counterpoint to the Rolfe and the Lang photographs, because it's so much about individual expression and particularity of experience and of the act committed here. And even though the speaker is nameless, and the poem invokes the namelessness of the boy, and also, a wider set of people that he represents here, with the quotations throughout, there's this repeated reminder that this is one boy, this is one act, this is an individual, this is a reminder of his particularity.
Lovely, thank you, Kate. I want to turn to Lily, then Camara, then I have a final thought, and I'm going to turn it to Sarah for a final thought, and then I'm going to say some thank yous and we'll get off. So Camara Brown, what do you think?
I can speak.
I'm sorry, I just jumped Lily. So sorry, hard to keep up. I do pretty good, but I screwed up.
Camara, do you want to go?
No, why don't we stay with what we planned, Lily and then Camara.
Sorry. Well, I wanted to respond a little bit to what Kate just said about individuality, because maybe what I'm going to say is pushing back on that, or maybe it reinforces what Kate said, I'm not sure. But I was thinking a lot about the pronouns and subjectivity in the poem, and I think the pronouns really stick out to me. There's our, you and your, and I and my, and they're all used in different contexts, including inside the quotation marks. And I've been thinking a lot about my reading or interpretation of how the stanzas in quotes are used, are that maybe it's Brooks almost like throwing her voice and speaking from the boy's subjectivity or point of view. And so in general, I'm just thinking about if we could draw a correlation between the quotation marks, like the quoted phrases, the pronoun use in this poem, and the ways that the speaker is claiming relation and like a relationship to the subject, the boy, a care for and love for him, and a consideration of his subjectivity. That's like something I find really moving about this poem. And then just to connect it to what we were talking about earlier in the conversation, Sarah talked about just some ways that you could see in the White Angel breadline photograph some of the photographer's some of Dorothea Lange's subjectivity, or like a foregrounding of the fact that we're using the medium of photography, not just like a clear window into what's happening, that you can see the guardrails and some slanted lines and things like that indicate the framing. So that's what I've been thinking about, is how to put those two elements of the two artworks together.
As usual, I love all the points that you made, Lily, but the last one is really a rock'em sock'em, because it reminds everybody that art is not a transparency. And the artists we admire tend to be ones that make it clear that this is not a transparency, that the act of seeing is shaping what is seen. And those guardrails are, in a sense, guardrails against that easy thought. Camara Brown, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think this poem, for me, reading it again, speaks to the importance and significance and beauty of like rereading. Rereading this poem in this moment was like shattering for me in terms of how I interpreted the poem, and specifically reading it out loud. I think I've talked about this before, maybe with this poem, that reading out loud, you can see the multiplicity of layers of meaning in terms of the homophones of like, if not a note, a whole. It makes me think of a whole note, actually, which like is a whole, like that is held throughout a whole music bar. When Amber Rose is reading it again, each one reminds me of what weather, you know? I think that this exceeding sun, a him, an HIM, all these sort of homophones or sonic qualities of the poem make me think that the poem, rereading it is important, but like re-saying it out loud, the voice of the poem really comes forward for me. And so I don't know, when I was rereading it, I kept on feeling as if Brooks or someone speaking the poem was trying to get me to speak it out loud, to speak these cries out loud and speak these lines out loud. And it makes me think about, I don't know, sort of, sort of what it's calling me to do here, and sort of think about my own voice and relationship between it and the language. And to take it back to the photograph, I don't have a sort of wrapping up of a final word on this, but a question of like, how do we think about voice in these photographs when, yes, we don't see many eyes or faces, but we also don't see any mouths. And what can we hear from these photographs when we listen is something that I've been thinking about too, thinking about voice.
Thank you, Camara. I have a quick final thought on the poem. I've talked a lot over the years about the broken window here, but today I have two new contexts for that thought, and they militate against each other. The one association I have is with Dorothea Lange. We like to say, well, you know, Brooks, who very much knew the modernist fragmentation of someone like William Carlos Williams, you know, was thinking about modern art, maybe Picasso-like Cubist, but also Williams with all of his broken glass. But I don't think so. I think that by the time you get to the 30s, which is such an important foundation idea, period, phase for Brooks, who's really doing most of her writing later, Broken Window is about someone like Lange, who was among the first to go out into the Depression economic devastation and think that broken windows and broken people and buildings falling down and the Dust Bowl and machinery that won't work because it's filled with dust and jalopies that won't take people out to the promised land of California, where they're going to get discriminated against as farm workers anyway. that broken window needed to be the art of the time. That's the art of crisis, the broken window. Take a photo of it and see the geometry of it and see it as beautiful and inspiring of all the homonymic amazingness that you can get when you're a good artist. The other reference to broken window, which is I've used in videos before about this, now is back in the news, and that is the erroneous, mistaken, and finally, ultimately racist theory of policing, of the policy of making sure every broken window gets either repaired or criminalized. The breaking of it gets criminalized. You wind up spending enormous amounts of police funding trying on this theory that you're going to prevent much worse from happening, much greater degradations from happening. This is now, I think everybody has admitted it, even a candidate for president who used to be the mayor of New York admitted it. Broken window, it's almost as if Brooks is looking forward to the future where finally we will see broken windows as not just the invitation to an aesthetic view of destruction as beautiful in its thought, but as a policing policy. This boy breaking glass, the first word is whose. It's not that he owns the glass, probably doesn't own the building in which the glass is broken, but he owns, as it were, the breaking of the glass. He's willing to own it. I just think and broken window is really suggestive of what we're facing now. And I'm so glad that Lang made me think of the broken windows of all of her photographs. Sarah Meister, give you a chance to say a final thought about the session or about Lang, and then I just want to do a few thank yous and we'll be off.
Okay, well, I'll be brief. I'll just say this was really a very moving experience for me. I loved hearing all of your observations. It has expanded, what brought me to think about Lang and poetry was the Archibald MacLeish's Land of the Free that he described as the opposite of a book of poetry illustrated by photographs, but instead a book of photographs illustrated by a poem. And that got me thinking about Lang and poetry, and you all have just expanded that 100-fold today. So thank you all so much. I hope we do another session alone on what Camara was saying about what do we think about voice in photographs, because I do think the work of Tina Campt and others about listening to photographs and hearing the registers that we aren't necessarily attuned to hearing could be fascinating. And I would love to think that through with all of you. And maybe I would just impart the Archibald MacLeish poem, begins with this statement of sort of what I read as, well, I don't think anyone would read it as uncertainty, which feels to me, again, newly relevant in our moment. So it begins, we don't know, we aren't sure, we've convinced ourselves of these things, but we're wondering. And I think in the spirit of inviting that sense of insecurity, of allowing us to look again at what we don't know and what we can do about that, you all have given me lots of opportunities. And I know all of the Seeing Through Photographs learners who joined today are similarly grateful. I mean, I'm grateful for them, but I think we are all grateful to you all at ModPo for expanding this. So thank you.
That's snaps for Sarah Meister. It's really a great show, and I hope that you're going to keep it open so that when the building opens, we might be able to get back and see it.
We're hoping that we'll have another month or so once we can safely reopen according to all guidelines for staff and for our public, that we are hopeful that Lang is waiting in the dark for us to be able to open it again. So
okay, that's great. So the course is Seeing Through Photographs. It's on Coursera. Our course is ModPo. You just, I think, type in modern poetry and you'll find us. All those in favor, just put your thumb up if you're in favor. All those in favor of having an ongoing partnership with MoMA, put your thumb up. I think it's unanimous. So Sarah, once the building is open, it's gonna be hard for you to keep us out. We'd like to do maybe at some point a webcast there in the building. That would be really a lot of fun. I want to thank Sarah's colleagues, Tasha, who had to leave early, Adelia Gregory, River Bullock, Sarah Bodinson, Kelly Cannon. Zach Gardner did all of the video stuff, which is not easy. Zach, fantastic. Chris Martin did the audio, which if it's possible is even harder. It's really hard to do what he did with those phone calls. And that was really good. I love the one from Italy. Did she use Skype, I think, to do it? She must have.
We actually had all like traditional phone calls today.
Wow, okay, so she called from Italy.
Yeah, long distance.
Thank you all. Gabe, thank you. Camara, welcome back to the ModPo team. Camara, we're so excited to have you back in the fall. Kate Colby, as always. Kate, what's the date in September you're going to be joining us? Do you remember offhand?
Dates.
Is it?
I don't know about dates anymore.
Oh, okay. Yeah. She's in the limbo up there. But anyway, sometime in September, Kate's either going to join us at the Arts Cafe or the Writers House or join us for one of these. Amaris, always wonderful to see you. Max McKenna, you're the best. Thank you. Hang out there in Chicago. Amber Rose, as always, amazing. Lily, you're so brilliant and wonderful, and it's good to see you. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll get this recording up and we'll make some clips and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.